I've never been the kind of guy who scares easily. Horror movies, ghost stories, urban legends, I love that stuff. The gorier, the creepier, the better. I'd stay up late watching slasher films with all the lights off, the house dead silent, waiting for the jump scare that never quite got me. Because it was all just fiction, no matter how realistic, I could always remind myself, it's just a movie. But that night changed everything. It was early October, the kind of night where autumn finally digs its claws in and you can feel the first real bite of cold in the air. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and rain had started to fall in a steady rhythm, tapping against the glass like fingers. My roommate, Jason, was out of town for the weekend, so I had the house to myself. I'd planned for a quiet night. Just me, a horror game, and a couple of beers. I was curled up on the couch, my laptop balanced on my knees, lost in the eerie digital world of the game. It was one of those immersive, slow-burn horror experiences where the tension builds and builds until something lunges at you from the shadows. The screen flickered as my character stepped into an abandoned hospital, the walls covered in peeling paint and cryptic warnings scrawled in blood. I was so absorbed that I almost missed the first flash of lightning. It was bright, filling the living room for just a second before plunging everything back into dimness. I barely glanced up, just enough to notice how dark it had gotten outside. The street was empty, the neighboring houses dark. And then I saw him. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A man stood on the sidewalk directly across the street, his figure barely visible in the rain. His hood was pulled up, casting a shadow over his face. And he didn't move. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, completely still. I frowned, shifting in my seat. Who the hell just stands outside in the pouring rain like that? Maybe he was waiting for someone, I reasoned. Maybe a neighbor had ordered an Uber, or he was just some guy passing through. Still, something about him made my stomach knot. It was the way he stood there, not fidgeting, not even shifting his weight, just walking. I shook it off and forced myself to refocus on the game, but my concentration was shot. Every few minutes I'd glance up at the window, expecting to see him gone, but he wasn't. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the street for just a second. The man hadn't moved an inch, still standing there, still facing my house. I swallowed hard, my fingers hovering over the laptop's trackpad. My heart beat a little faster now. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Another flash of lightning, and he was gone. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. The sidewalk was empty, nothing but slick pavement reflecting the glow of the street lamp. I exhaled, forcing a laugh. He must have walked off when I wasn't looking. But then the doorbell rang, the sound sliced through the quiet house, sharp and insistent. I jolted upright, my laptop sliding off my lap and onto the floor. I wasn't expecting anyone. The doorbell rang again, longer this time. More urgent. I stood slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. My first thought was that it could be Jason. Maybe his plans had changed, maybe he'd forgotten his keys. But no, he was 3 states away at a wedding. I crept toward the front door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood. The rain pounded against the house, the wind moaning through the trees. I hesitated, then leaned forward, peering through the peephole. My stomach turned to ice. The man in the hoodie was standing on my porch. Up close, he was even more unsettling. His hood was still pulled low over his face, shadowing his features, but I could feel his eyes on me. He wasn't wet like I expected. His clothes should have been soaked from standing in the storm, but they were just damp, like he'd barely been outside at all. My fingers hovered over the deadbolt. Every instinct screamed at me not to open the door, and then he spoke. "Did you forget?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but I heard it clear as day. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. What the hell did that mean? I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, listening to the rain. Seconds passed, then minutes. No more knocking, no more doorbell. Finally, I forced myself to look through the peephole again. He was gone. I double-checked the locks before backing away, trying to calm the tremor in my hands. Just a prank, I told myself, some weird psycho messing with me. I wanted to believe that, but then I saw it. A small piece of paper taped neatly to the glass of the door. I swallowed hard and stepped closer, peeling it off with trembling fingers. 3 words, written in precise, slanted handwriting. Did you forget? I didn't sleep that night. 2 nights later, I had almost convinced myself it was just some elaborate prank. Maybe a stupid dare. Maybe some creep who thought it'd be funny to mess with a guy alone in his house. But then my phone rang at 2:47 a.m. The caller ID was blocked. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen. Every rational part of my brain told me to ignore it, let it go to voicemail, but I answered. Hello? Silence. I waited, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. Then, a whisper. Did you forget? The line went dead. I sat there in the darkness, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles ached. I wasn't alone. I felt him before I saw him. The air in my room had shifted, the way it does when someone else is standing near. The faintest creak of a floorboard behind me. I turned my head and my breath stopped in my throat. He was there, standing in the corner of my bedroom. The hood still concealed his face, but I could see his hands, pale, motionless, just standing there, as if he'd been there all along. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then he took a step forward. That broke the spell. I lunged for the lamp, fumbling for the switch. The light flashed on, and he was gone. Just like that. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I found another note on my bedside table. You will remember. Jason came back a few days later. I didn't tell him what happened. What was I supposed to say? That some faceless thing had walked into my bedroom and left a note on my nightstand? It's been years since that night. I never saw him again. But every now and then, on stormy nights, I wake up with the distinct feeling that someone's standing in the corner of my room, watching, waiting. And I can still hear the voice, soft as the wind, whispering in my ear. Did you forget? I never told anyone what happened that night, not really. Maybe I mentioned something vague to Jason when he got back, told him I had a weird experience, maybe some guy messing with me, but I didn't say what I saw. I didn't tell him about the whispering voice, or the figure in my room, or the note that I still keep hidden in the back of a drawer. You will remember. I don't know why I never threw it away. Maybe because I was afraid that if I did, it would find its way back to me. Or maybe because part of me knew that I would never forget. Years passed. I moved out of that house, got a new job, a new place. But sometimes on stormy nights, I still wake up and feel like someone is standing in the corner of my room, watching. And I think about the man in the hoodie. I think about what he wanted me to remember. I tell myself it was just a strange night, that it meant nothing. I almost believe it. But then I heard about Daniel Pierce and his son. Daniel lived out in Montana, a place I had never been, in a house surrounded by woods. His story wasn't like mine. It wasn't about someone breaking in or whispering on the phone. It wasn't about a stranger in a hoodie standing on his porch. But the moment I heard it, I knew it was the same thing. The same kind of thing. The kind of thing that waits in the dark, watching. Daniel was a single father. He and his son Caleb lived in a small house about 20 minutes outside of town. A place with a long gravel driveway and a backyard that stretched out to meet the trees. It was peaceful, the kind of home most people dream of. But Daniel told me that sometimes, on certain nights, it felt too quiet. Like the silence was waiting for something to break it. Like there was something just beyond the trees, listening. He and Caleb had a tradition. Whenever a big storm rolled in, they would sit together in the gazebo behind the house, watching the rain and listening to the thunder. Caleb loved storms. He was only 7, but Daniel said he wasn't afraid of them the way most kids were. There was something about the wind, the way the sky cracked open with light, that fascinated him. The night it happened, the storm had been building for hours. The sky had turned that deep, heavy gray, the kind that meant something big was coming. By the time Daniel and Caleb stepped outside, the first drops of rain were already falling, pattering against the gazebo roof. They sat together, eating snacks, listening to the storm grow. And then Caleb pointed to the tree line. "Dad," he said, "who's that?" Daniel followed his son's gaze, squinting through the rain. At first he saw nothing, just the trees, the branches swaying in the wind. Then, in the next flash of lightning, he saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the woods. He couldn't make out details, not at that distance, not in the rain, but it was tall, too tall to be a kid. The figure didn't move. It didn't shift or fidget the way a normal person would. It just stood there, perfectly still, watching them. Daniel's first thought was that it was a hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost, but something about the way it stood there, the way it didn't react to the storm, set off a deep, primal kind of fear in his gut. Lightning flashed again, and the figure was gone. Caleb frowned. Where did they go? Daniel didn't have an answer. He told himself the rain was playing tricks on his eyes, that there was never anyone there at all, but when he looked back at the woods, the feeling remained, the sense that something was still standing there just beyond his vision, waiting for the next flash of light. He forced a smile. Probably just a shadow, he said. Let's go inside, buddy. Caleb didn't argue. That night, long after his son had gone to bed, Daniel found himself staring out the kitchen window, looking toward the trees. The storm had passed, but the wind still moved through the branches, rustling the leaves. He knew it was stupid. He had checked the locks, set the alarm, made sure everything was safe, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them inside, that some part of the night had come home with them. He finally forced himself to go to bed, telling himself he was being paranoid. Then, at 2:14 a.m., Caleb screamed. Daniel was out of bed before he was fully awake, his body reacting before his mind caught up. He ran down the hall, threw open his son's door, and found Caleb sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with terror. "He's outside," Caleb whispered. His voice was shaking. "He's looking at me." Daniel's blood turned to ice. He turned his head, his eyes landing on the window. For a long, breathless moment, he saw nothing. Just the trees, the moonlight glinting off the glass. And then, in the next shift of shadows, he saw the face. It was just outside the window, too high up to belong to a normal person. The features were indistinct, lost in darkness, but Daniel could feel its eyes on him, staring, unblinking. He lunged for the window, yanking the curtain closed. His heart was hammering against his ribs. "It's okay," he told Caleb, though his own voice shook. "It's okay, buddy." But it wasn't. He grabbed the baseball bat from his closet and ran outside, rage and fear boiling together in his chest. Whoever was messing with his kid, whoever was watching them from the dark, was about to regret it. But when he reached the backyard, there was nothing. The grass was wet and untouched, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Daniel stood there, his breath fogging in the cold night air, gripping the bat so hard his knuckles ached. He knew what he had seen. He knew. The next morning he searched the woods. He walked deep into the trees, deeper than he ever had before, looking for any sign of him, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no trace of any other person, just the quiet. Too much quiet. Daniel told himself it was over, that maybe it had never happened at all, but the feeling never left. Days passed, then weeks. The storm became a memory. Then one night, Caleb came to his room, silent, his small hands gripping the hem of his father's shirt. Daniel sat up. "What's wrong, buddy?" Caleb looked up at him, his eyes dark and full of something Daniel had never seen before. A knowing fear. "He's still out there," Caleb whispered. Daniel swallowed. "How do you know?" Caleb hesitated, his small fingers twisting together. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost lost in the night, he said, "Because sometimes, when it's really quiet, I can still hear him breathing." Daniel didn't sleep that night. And even now, after all these years, whenever a storm rolls in and the wind starts howling through the trees, he wonders if the figure is still out there, watching, waiting. I didn't know how to respond when Daniel told me what happened. The way he described the figure in the woods, the way Caleb could still hear it breathing even when nothing was there, it stayed with me. It wasn't just the story itself, but the way he told it, the weight in his voice, like something had followed him out of that night and never let go. I wanted to believe it was just his imagination, that there was some rational explanation. I told myself that long enough to almost believe it. Then I heard about Clara. Clara had never been the type to scare easily. She'd grown up in New York City, spent years surrounded by the constant hum of life, the never-ending lights and noise that made the dark feel smaller. Moving upstate had been a choice for peace, a chance to slow down, to have a home of her own. The old Victorian house she found was perfect. Big, quiet, just far enough from town to feel secluded without being isolated. She fell in love with it the moment she stepped inside. The basement was the only part of the house she didn't like. The first time she opened the door, the smell hit her. Damp, stale, the kind of scent that clung to old wood and forgotten places. The stairs were narrow, steep, leading down into a space that felt too dark, even with the bare light bulb flickering weakly from the ceiling. The landlord had mentioned the basement was unfinished, used for storage, nothing more. She didn't question it, she just avoided it. For weeks, everything felt normal. She unpacked, settled in, started to make the house feel like home. The creaks in the floorboards, the occasional groan of the pipes, she chalked it up to age, the way old houses breathe. The unease only came when she walked past the basement door, a cold prickle at the back of her neck, the irrational feeling that if she opened it, she wouldn't be alone down there. She ignored it. Then the storm came. Rain lashed against the windows, wind howling through the trees that lined the backyard. She curled up on the couch with a book, the glow of a single lamp casting warm light against the walls. Thunder rolled in the distance, a slow, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the house. The first sound came so quietly she almost didn't hear it, a faint, rhythmic thump. She lifted her head, listening. It had come from beneath her. She tried to reason with herself. Old houses settle, pipes shift, it was nothing. Then it came again. Thump, thump. Louder this time. She set her book down, heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. It was coming from the basement. She grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked to the door. It stood slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of darkness to peek through. She didn't remember leaving it open. Her fingers hesitated on the handle. The rational part of her mind told her it was just the wind, a draft, something simple. The part of her that had been ignoring the creeping unease told her to turn around and walk away. She opened the door. The air that rushed up from the basement was colder than it should have been. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the wooden steps, the bare concrete floor below. The thumping had stopped. She forced herself to take a step down. Then another. The silence pressed in around her, heavy and suffocating. She scanned the room, light bouncing off rusted shelves and stacks of boxes left behind by the previous tenants. Nothing looked out of place. Then she saw it. A door. It was set into the farthest wall, nearly hidden behind an old wooden dresser. She could have sworn it hadn't been there before. She stepped closer. The wood was old, cracked with age. A rusted padlock hung from the latch, the kind that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The thumping started again. It came from behind the door, her breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back, heart pounding in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out, but she stood frozen, staring at the locked door, waiting for the sound to come again. Silence. She turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her, locking it, shoving a chair against the handle. She stood there, shaking, chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning she told herself she had imagined it. She hadn't actually heard something knocking from behind a locked door. She had been alone in that basement, but that night the dream came. She was standing in the basement in front of the door. The lock was gone. The door was open just enough for her to see inside. A small, dark room. A wooden chair in the center. A girl sat in it. Her hair fell in tangled strands over her face, her arms limp at her sides. Clara couldn't move, couldn't wake up. The girl lifted her head. Her eyes were sunken, dark, wrong. Her lips parted, voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you leave me?" Clara woke up gasping. She knew she couldn't stay. She started packing the next morning, throwing clothes into a suitcase, shoving books into boxes without care. She didn't care about breaking the lease. She just needed to go. The house was silent, too silent. It was waiting. She was almost done when she heard it, a creak from behind her. Her stomach twisted. She turned. The basement door was open. The chair she had wedged against the handle was on the floor. The lock was undone. The door gaped wide. The smell that drifted up was thick and rotting. And then she heard it. The breathing. She ran. She didn't stop until she was in her car, engine roaring to life, hands trembling so hard she could barely grip the wheel. As she peeled out of the driveway, she risked one last glance at the house. The girl stood in the upstairs window, watching, waiting. Clara never went back. She moved across the country, started fresh, built a new life, but no matter how far she ran, no matter how many miles she put between herself and that house, she could never escape the dream. Every night, the same whisper. Why did you leave me? I kept thinking about Clara's story long after she told it to me. The locked door, the whisper in the dark, the girl who wasn't supposed to be there. I told myself that none of it made sense, that it was just a series of eerie coincidences, but deep down, I knew better. There was something about it that felt too familiar, the way the fear clung to her, the way she carried it with her no matter how far she ran. It was the same fear Daniel had. The same fear I had. It wasn't just Clara, it wasn't just Daniel, and then I heard about Victor. Victor Reynolds wasn't the kind of man who scared easily. He had spent the last decade traveling across the country for work, a salesman with a well-worn routine of highways, cheap motels, and long nights behind the wheel. He had driven through every kind of weather, crossed state lines in the dead of night more times than he could count. The road was home, in a way, but after that night in Arizona, he never drove after dark again. The storm had been coming for hours, a distant wall of black clouds creeping across the desert sky. He had been driving since noon, planning to make it to Flagstaff before calling it a night. The road stretched empty before him, miles of asphalt cutting through the vast nothingness of the desert. Rain began to fall in slow, heavy drops, dotting his windshield, the wipers sweeping them away in steady rhythms. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the wet pavement, the occasional road sign flashing by. Then the lightning came. It split the sky in a jagged burst of white, revealing the landscape for a fraction of a second. That was when he saw him, a man standing in the middle of the road. Victor's heart lurched. He slammed on the brakes, tires screeching against the wet asphalt. The car skidded, fishtailing for a moment before coming to a stop. His hands were gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. His pulse pounded in his ears. He looked up. The road was empty, no one was there. He exhaled sharply, a shaky breath that did nothing to slow the adrenaline racing through his veins. He had seen someone, he was sure of it. A man standing motionless in the rain, dressed in white. But now there was nothing but darkness and falling water. He shook his head, trying to steady himself. Maybe it had been a trick of the storm, a shadow cast by the lightning, the exhaustion of the long drive catching up to him. He took another deep breath, put the car back in gear, and pressed on. 15 minutes later, he saw him again. It was just a flicker of movement at first, something shifting in his peripheral vision, a shape at the edge of the road, blurred by rain and darkness. Then another flash of lightning, and he saw him clearly. The same man, standing just beyond the guardrail, head tilted slightly, watching him pass. Victor's stomach twisted. He pressed his foot harder against the accelerator, gripping the wheel as the car sped forward. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He didn't want to know if the man was still standing there, if he had turned to watch him go. The rain intensified, hammering against the roof, the road nearly invisible beneath the flood of water. The wipers fought to keep up. Victor forced himself to focus on the drive, on the highway stretching endlessly ahead. He just needed to get to the next town, find a motel, shake off the creeping unease clawing at the back of his mind. Then, something darted across the road. His breath caught in his throat. It was too fast to be an animal, too smooth, too deliberate, a pale blur moving inhumanly quick through the rain. His hands jerked the wheel instinctively, the tires hydroplaning on the slick pavement. The car spun, headlights sweeping across the desert in a dizzying arc before slamming into something solid. The world tilted, the sound of metal crunching against rock filled his ears. Then, silence. His head was throbbing, his fingers trembled as he reached up, touching his temple. Wet. Blood, but not much. He had hit his head, but not hard enough to knock him out. The car had come to rest half in a ditch, the front bumper crumpled against a boulder. He let out a shaky breath and fumbled for the door handle. The car was still drivable. He just needed to get his bearings, figure out how bad the damage was, call for a tow if he had to. The rain poured down as he stepped out, soaking through his shirt in seconds. He squinted through the downpour, scanning the road. The storm had swallowed the landscape. Nothing but black sky and flashes of distant lightning illuminating the endless stretch of highway. Then he saw him, standing just beyond the guardrail, the man in white. Victor's breath caught in his throat. He was closer now, close enough to see the way his clothes clung to his frame, wet from the rain, close enough to see that his face was wrong, too pale, too smooth, like something unfinished. The man didn't move. He only watched. Victor took a step back, pulse hammering. The headlights flickered. For the briefest second, everything went dark. When the lights came back, the man was gone. Victor's chest heaved. His mind raced through 100 explanations, but none of them made sense. He stumbled back toward the car, his hands fumbling for his phone. He needed to call someone, anyone. The screen was wet, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through his contacts. A voice crackled through the rain, low, faint, almost drowned by the storm. "Help me!" Victor froze. It hadn't come from his phone. Slowly he turned. The man was standing right behind him. A strangled gasp tore from Victor's throat as he stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the wet pavement. The man's eyes, black pits, empty and endless, locked onto his. The mouth moved, but no sound came this time. Victor ran. He didn't look back. He scrambled into the car, slammed the door shut, jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. The headlights cut through the storm. The road ahead was empty. The man was gone. The next morning, the police found him sitting in his car at a gas station miles away, staring blankly ahead. They asked him what had happened, why he had called emergency services and then never spoken. He couldn't answer. He didn't know how to explain. An officer asked him if he had seen anything unusual on the road. Victor hesitated. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then pulled something from his pocket. A newspaper clipping, old and yellowed with age. Local man found dead in storm. Body discovered after days of searching. Dressed in white. Victor's hands trembled as he stared at the date. 60 years ago. The officer exhaled. "You're not the first to see him," he said. "Won't be the last." Victor never drove that road at night again. I used to think stories like Victor's were just urban legends. Old ghosts bound to the roads they died on, trapped in the echoes of their own demise. But after hearing what he saw, after seeing the way his hands shook when he told me, I knew better. I knew because I had seen something too. Something I couldn't explain. Something that lingered long after the night had passed. Emily Shaw hadn't been looking for trouble. She was just trying to get home. She had been driving for hours, the highway stretching endlessly before her, the dotted white lines blurring together under the dim glow of her headlights. The plan had been to reach her sister's place by midnight, but a wrong turn had cost her nearly an hour, and exhaustion was settling deep into her bones. The radio crackled with static as she flipped through stations, the distant hum of country music barely audible over the whir of the tires against the asphalt. Then she saw the neon sign, Roadway Inn. Low rates. Vacancy. The place wasn't much to look at, just a row of single-story rooms lined up like dominoes, the flickering sign casting a dull, buzzing glow over the parking lot. She didn't care. She just needed a bed, a few hours of sleep before getting back on the road. She pulled into a spot near the front office, cutting the engine and rubbing at her eyes. The building looked empty, but the open sign in the window told her someone had to be inside. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped into the lobby. The man behind the counter looked up from a faded newspaper, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw her. He was older, mid-50s maybe, with thinning hair and a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. "You need a room?" he asked, already reaching for the key rack. "Yeah, just for the night." His fingers hovered over the keys, hesitating for a fraction of a second before he nodded. "Cash or card?" She handed him her credit card. His gaze flickered toward the window, out to the parking lot, then back to her. "You keep those curtains shut, you hear me?" Emily frowned. "Excuse me?" The man slid the key across the counter. "Just keep 'em shut, and if you hear something outside, don't go looking." A cold prickle crept up the back of her neck. "Is there something I should know?" she asked carefully. He exhaled, the cigarette smoke curling around his face. "It's just, some folks see things out there. You don't want to be one of them." She laughed, but it came out thin, forced. "All right, I'll keep 'em shut." The man didn't smile. She took the key and walked back to her car, trying to shake the uneasy feeling curling in her stomach. Room 17 was near the end of the row, just past the glow of the flickering neon. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the scent of stale air and old carpet hitting her instantly. The room was basic: queen bed, a TV bolted to the dresser, a nightstand with a chipped lamp. She dropped her bag by the bed, kicking off her shoes and pulling the curtains shut. Outside, the wind rattled through the lot, sending dry leaves skittering across the pavement. She turned on the TV for background noise, flipping mindlessly through channels until she landed on some late-night infomercial. She was asleep within minutes. The sound woke her. A slow, deliberate shuffle outside her window. Her eyes snapped open. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she had really heard it or if it had just been part of her dream. Then it came again, a steady, rhythmic pacing just beyond the thin motel walls. Her pulse kicked up, hammering against her ribs. The man at the desk, his warning. She stayed perfectly still, listening. Whoever was outside wasn't knocking, wasn't calling out, just walking, back and forth, back and forth. She reached for her phone, fingers fumbling in the dark. 3:08 a.m. The footsteps stopped, her breath hitched. Silence. Then something tapped against the glass. Her body went rigid, every muscle locking up. Another tap, louder this time. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. She wasn't going to look. She wasn't going to be one of the people who saw. Her heart pounded as the scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like something testing the glass. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. She waited, counting the seconds in her head. 5, 10, 15. Nothing. The room was silent except for the hum of the TV. She forced herself to breathe, unclenching her fists. Maybe it was just the wind, a branch scraping against the window. Maybe she had imagined it. Then from outside, a voice. Low. Flat. "Did you see me?" Emily's stomach lurched. She slapped a hand over her mouth, choking down the scream that clawed at her throat. The voice didn't come again. She sat there, heart racing, staring at the drawn curtains as if they might move on their own. She stayed like that until the sun started to rise, until the orange glow seeped through the edges of the fabric, chasing away the night. When she finally forced herself to move, to slide out of bed and grab her bag, she hesitated at the window. She shouldn't. She knew she shouldn't. But she pulled the curtain back anyway. The parking lot was empty, except for the wet footprints leading from her window to the trees. Emily was in her car and on the road within minutes, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. She didn't stop, not for coffee, not for gas, not until she was hours away from that motel, from the footprints, from whatever had been outside her room. A week later, she told her sister about it, the pacing, the scratching, the voice. Her sister had gone quiet for a long moment before finally saying, "You need to look up that motel." Emily did. The articles were old, but the story was always the same. Guests who had seen the man in the lot were never seen again. She closed the laptop and never spoke about it again. But sometimes late at night when she was alone in her apartment, she would hear it. A soft scratch, scratch, scratch at the window, and a voice in the dark. "Did you see me?" I used to believe that fear was something you could leave behind, that if you drove far enough, moved often enough, or changed your surroundings, whatever haunted you would fade into the distance, just another bad memory blurred by time. But after hearing Emily's story, after seeing the way she still flinched at shadows, I knew better. Fear wasn't something you escaped. It was something that followed. And it followed Jake Lawson all the way to the lighthouse. Jake had spent most of his life on the water. Fishing was in his blood, passed down through generations, and the ocean was the only place that ever truly felt like home. He wasn't the kind of man who spooked easily. Storms, high waves, the endless stretch of black water beneath him, none of it ever fazed him. But something about that island, that lighthouse, stayed with him long after he left. He and his friends had been planning the trip for months. The lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, one of those places that carried rumors like barnacles on the hull of a ship. Some said the last keeper had gone mad, others that he had disappeared entirely. Jake never put much stock in ghost stories, but the place was isolated, quiet, and perfect for a weekend away from the world. They set out early, the boat cutting clean through the water as the mainland disappeared behind them. The sky was bright, the waves gentle, and for a while it felt like any other trip. They reached the island just before sundown, pulling the boat onto the rocky shore, the lighthouse standing tall and silent above them. The place was exactly as they'd heard, abandoned, untouched, forgotten. The paint had peeled away, exposing weather-worn wood beneath. The door hung slightly ajar, groaning softly in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. They set up camp just outside the lighthouse, building a fire as the sky darkened. The wind picked up, howling through the trees that lined the island's edge. The only light came from the fire and the old beacon above them, still turning, still sweeping across the black waves like a lonely eye searching for something long lost. Then the knocking started. It was faint at first, a slow, deliberate tap, 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 from the top of the lighthouse. Jake glanced at his friends, waiting for someone to explain it, to laugh it off as an old shutter caught in the wind, but no one spoke. The knocking continued. Someone needed to check it out. Jake grabbed his flashlight, stepping into the darkness. The wooden steps creaked beneath his weight as he climbed, the beam of light bouncing off the curved walls. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if something was waiting for him just beyond the next turn. He reached the top. Nothing. The lantern room was empty. The wind screamed through the broken glass panes, but there was nothing else. No loose shutters, no one hiding in the shadows. Then he saw the book. An old journal, its pages yellowed with time, lay open on the rusted console. The words scrawled inside were hurried, frantic, desperate. If the light goes out, he comes. A chill crawled down Jake's spine. He turned, making his way back down, telling himself it was just another old story, just another legend meant to keep people away. Then the power flickered. For a heartbeat, the island was swallowed in darkness. Jake stopped. A sound echoed from the stairs below. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Coming up. The flashlight flickered, casting wild, dancing shadows against the curved walls. The steps continued, heavy, steady, climbing toward him. Then he saw it. A figure on the staircase, rising from the darkness below. Its form was black, featureless, shifting like smoke caught in a current. The air grew thick, heavy, wrong. Jake couldn't breathe. The beacon sputtered back to life. The figure disappeared. Jake bolted, his feet pounding against the wooden steps as he raced back to the others. His friends barely had time to react before he was shoving them toward the boat. "We're leaving, now!" The storm rolled in fast, the wind howling, the waves crashing against the rocks as they pushed the boat off the shore. Jake looked back only once. The lighthouse stood tall against the storm, its beacon burning bright. Then, for just a moment, the light flickered. Just long enough to see the figure standing at the edge of the island, watching. They never spoke about it again, but years later, Jake heard about another group who had gone to the lighthouse. They never came back. Fear is a strange thing. It isn't just about ghosts or shadows lurking in the dark. It's about the unknown, the things we can't explain, the moments that remind us how small we really are. The stories I've told you aren't just meant to scare you. They serve as reminders that sometimes the things we dismiss, the warnings we ignore, and the instincts we suppress are the very things that could keep us safe. Ethan Carter thought horror movies had prepared him for fear, but the hooded figure outside his home taught him otherwise. Real fear isn't something you can pause or turn off. It lingers, it watches, it waits. His story reminds us that sometimes the things we try to forget are the very things that refuse to be forgotten. Daniel Pierce believed in logic, in what could be seen and explained, but Caleb's innocent question, "Who's that?" shattered that illusion. The figure by the trees never harmed them, but it left its mark. Not all hauntings are physical. Some stay with you in the way the wind rustles the leaves at night, the way the woods feel just a little too quiet. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Clara Morgan thought the basement was just another creepy part of an old house, until she heard the knocking, the locked door, the voice in the dark, the girl who wasn't supposed to be there. The past has a way of demanding attention, especially when it's been buried. Some places hold memories stronger than others, and not all of them are willing to stay forgotten. Victor Reynolds had spent his life on the road, never afraid of a storm, until the storm brought him something unnatural. The man in white had been waiting, just like he had waited for others before. There are places in this world where time bends, where the past and present blur, where the dead refuse to stay dead. If you ever see something on the side of the road that shouldn't be there, keep driving. Emily Shaw was just looking for a place to rest, but some places aren't meant for rest. The motel clerk had tried to warn her, but some warnings don't make sense until it's too late. She kept her curtains shut, she locked her door, but she still heard the voice. Did you see me? Some things only need to be noticed to take hold. If someone warns you not to look, don't. Jake Lawson thought the lighthouse was just another forgotten place, a relic of the past. But some places are abandoned for a reason. The journal had been clear: if the light goes out, he comes. Some warnings are meant to be followed. Some rules exist for survival. And if something tells you to keep the light on, don't let it go dark. These stories aren't just about ghosts and shadows. They're about listening to warnings, to instincts, to the things we pretend not to see. Fear isn't just a feeling. Sometimes it's a message. To everyone who stayed until the end of this journey, thank you. Your support keeps these stories alive, and your curiosity keeps the darkness at bay. If you've ever had an experience you can't explain, share it. You never know who else might have seen the same thing. Stay safe, keep your lights on, and remember, some things watch from the dark, waiting for someone to notice.